Hello everyone. I'm glad to present Professor Daniel Treesman, one of the most prominent scholars of Russia and autocratic regimes today. He got his Ph.D. from Harvard, and currently he is a professor of political science at UCLA. He has published 4 books and numerous articles in leading political science and economic journals such as APSR, American Economic Review, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy. His research focuses on Russia as well as comparative political economy, including the analysis of democratization, politics of authoritarian states, and corruption. His book, The Return of Russia's Journey from Gorbachev to Medvedev, was one of the best political books of 2011 by Financial Times ranking, and he also edited the joint volume based on research of many scholars called The New Autocracy, Information, Politics, and Policy in Putin's Russia. We're lucky to have him here today talking about his project, Informational Autocracy in Putin's Russia. And dear participants, I will be collecting Q&A for Professor Treesman. I will voice clarifying questions during the talk and other questions after the talk is finished. So I think that Professor Treesman, you can start.
Thanks very much, Natalia, and thanks everybody for coming. This work is joint with Sergei Guriev from Sciences Po in Paris, and the key idea behind this work. Could you hit the slide? Key idea is that there seems to be, or at least to us, there seems to be a new kind of authoritarian regime which is more and more prominent in the last few decades. If we look back at the 20th century, the typical dictatorship was quite violent, or very violent in many cases. Often also had an official ideology that was enforced on the population. The image of a dictator was often somebody in a military uniform, like these cases that you see here. Slide, please. But if you look at some of the authoritarian leaders in more recent decades, they look a little bit different. Here's an example of 4. Slide, please. It seemed to us, as we thought about the kinds of dictators that we see in Peru recently, Fujimori, Hungary, Viktor Orban, Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, and Russia, Vladimir Putin, it seemed that they were really exemplifying a new model of authoritarian rule. They achieved the same kind of control as the old dictators. They managed to monopolize power, to eliminate checks and balances, but they did so with much less violence or even fear. There isn't much ideology in the mix. There's a kind of diffuse anti-Western resentment, sometimes a veneer of socialism or nationalism, but definitely no official ideology that's enforced on the population. And these dictators pretend to be democrats. They imitate democracy. They hold elections, although there's often some falsification. And most important, they seem, as best we can tell, at least at times, to be genuinely popular. And they definitely seem to seek popular support, to build public approval. Slide, please. So looking at these cases, we came up with a new model of authoritarian governments, which we call informational autocracy. Basic idea behind this is that there are 2 groups in any society, the general public and what we call the informed elite. The informed elite isn't necessarily rich. It's people who are highly educated, who have communication skills. They're generally more internationally connected and politically savvy. They see through the deceptions of the dictator, but they're a relatively small part of the population. Most of the population is more susceptible to the dictator's communications, the dictator's propaganda. And so the key task for dictators is to prevent the informed elite from uniting with the general public and revealing the dictator's true nature and organizing coordinated resistance. Now, the strategy of typical 20th century dictators was to terrorize or brainwash both the informed elite and the general public. The new model replaces terror with manipulation of information, managing the flows of information to the public in order to keep it loyal. Slide, please. So, as I said, manipulation of information, the new dictators use propaganda to convince the public that the leader's competent, that he's an effective leader who can provide prosperity and security. They either co-opt or censor private media to stop the informed elite from revealing the leader's incompetence. As I said, they imitate democracy, they hold elections, and so on. And they only use violent repression against the public as a last resort. Basically, it reveals that the leader is not benevolent, not competent, and undermines the strategy of informational autocracy. So they only revert to a violent strategy in extreme cases when they have no other option. They also conceal the fact that the government's manipulating information. If they are open about their censorship, then that in itself sends the message that they're less competent, that they're not confident about the public's support. Slide, please. So we see that model emerging, and I should say it's not completely new. What's changed is the balance between this informational autocracy and the old style, more overt, violent dictatorship. If we're right about that, then what should we observe? Well, we should see recent authoritarian leaders limiting violent repression, denying involvement in political killings when these occur, imitating democracy, paying attention to opinion polls, ratings, political consultants, and so on to boost their popularity, manipulating elections when necessary. We should see them in their rhetoric to the general public, emphasizing their competence, their good leadership rather than violent threats, rather than trying to scare the public. We should see them controlling the state media, but not with heavy-handed, overt official ideology, more with a kind of subtle pro-regime bias, or maybe not so subtle, but sort of ideology. And they should often allow some private media. They should either co-opt it to present a positive image of them, or censor it discreetly so that people don't realize it's being censored. Slide, please. And we should also see a divide between what we call the informed elite and the general public. So the informed elite should be more aware of the dictator's true strategy, the general public less aware. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to try and convince you that we actually do observe dictators who are characterized in this way, and then briefly I'll illustrate with Putin's Russia, which is one of the classic cases that we see of this kind of informational autocracy. Slide, please. I want to be very clear from the start. We're not saying there are no old-style dictators left. These two guys are very much using the playbook of 20th century violent dictators. What we're saying is that there's just significantly fewer old-style overt violent dictators and more of the new kind of informational autocrats. Slide, please. Okay, so first implication of the model: dictators should use less violence. So what evidence do we have of this? Slide, please. Yeah. So one database contains estimates of the number of ongoing mass killings by year. This is the database of Ulfelder and Valentino. They define mass killings as actions of state agents that result in the intentional death of at least 1,000 non-combatants from a discrete group in a period of sustained violence. So it's a relatively high level of violence. And if we look at the occurrence, the incidence of these mass killings in non-democracies, we see this actually peaked in 1991, but there's been a very sharp fall in the frequency of these in dictatorships since then. Next slide, please. Now, this focuses on relatively large violent events. We wanted to find out more about the lower level acts of violence that are common in dictatorships. Next slide, please. And so that we created a database of our own on what we call authoritarian control techniques. Next slide, please. So we collected data on two things. First of all, on the number of political killings by the state. This is killings by state agents of unarmed civilians for political reasons. And we include in that various things, such as political executions, executions of political prisoners, deaths of political prisoners in custody, killing of unarmed protesters, basically an aggregate of various different kinds of killings by state agents for political reasons. We collected information on this for all authoritarian governments from 1946 to 2015. We also collected data on, I think we need to go back one slide, please, on political prisoners in the highest year for each dictator. Okay, so here's the data on political killings. We consulted almost 1,000 sources, from human rights reports to history works to newspapers to Truth Commission reports from countries that had been authoritarian and then changed. And we group countries, well, we analyze cohorts of leaders because violence can vary significantly within the tenure of any leader. So what we did was estimate the total number of killings for a given leader and average over the time in power. So we arrive at a number of political killings per year on average for each leader. And then we compare the leaders that came to power in different decades. And what we see here is that the proportion of authoritarian leaders who had very high levels of political killings has decreased. The proportion with more than 100 political killings a year has been decreasing since the 1960s cohort, and the proportion with more than 10 political killings has fallen sharply since the 1980s. It actually peaked at the end of the Cold War in the 1980s and has come down sharply. Next slide, please. As I was saying, we also collected data on political prisoners, how many political prisoners a dictator imprisoned. To do this, it became clear that we couldn't hope to get a complete accounting for all years. So what we did was we focused on the year in which we found the largest number reported of political prisoners. That's likely to be the year, well, there's more likely to be data about the year in which political prisoners were most numerous than any other. So here's the data. Here's what the data look like for that. We see since the 1970s a pretty big fall in the proportion of authoritarian regimes with large numbers of political prisoners. Now, I should say, obviously, this data is far from precise. We don't imagine that it's complete. We think it's useful for painting in very broad strokes the overall picture, for making distinctions between orders of magnitude, between dictators who kill 10,000 and who kill 1,000 or just 100, and who hold hugely different levels and numbers of political prisoners. Okay, so both of these data sources, or both of these elements in the data, suggest a sharp decrease in the level of overt violence by authoritarian regimes in recent decades. Next slide, please. Finally, what proportion of authoritarian regimes are alleged to use torture against political prisoners? We also collected data on this. We see that actually also peaked in the cohort of dictators that took power in the 1980s, come down a lot since then, although sadly it still remains extremely high. Around 3/4 of dictators are alleged by human rights organizations or others to have used torture against political prisoners or detainees. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the first implication of the model, that there should be less visible violence, less political violence. A second aspect of that is that regimes should try to conceal violence when they do use it, rather than publicizing it. Now, the 20th century overt dictators were very open about the use of violence. In fact, they deliberately publicized the brutality of the state in order to deter citizens and to intimidate citizens and scare them into political quiescence. So let me show a few details, a few examples of this to document the change. Right, next slide, please. So the idea is that you make violence as public as possible to keep the general public scared. Next slide, please. Our first example is Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. He paraded the corpse of one executed rebel in a chair throughout the province of that rebel, forced local people to dance with his remains. Next slide, please. Francisco Franco, it turns out, even had a special criminal penalty, a sentence called garrote y prensa, which loosely translates as strangulation by garrote with press coverage. So for political enemies who he wanted not just to kill but to humiliate, this was the sentence he used. Next slide. This wonderful individual, former ruler of Yemen, had the heads of executed opponents hung on the branches of trees as a warning to others. Next slide. And Muammar Gaddafi, there's a great quote of Gaddafi where he says, he's not one of those feeble dictators who kills people in private. He says, no, he whom we have executed on TV. And this really gets to the heart of the old style 20th century model. You don't just kill people to get rid of an individual. You kill people to send a message. You do it on TV. You use the media to spread the intimidation more broadly. Next slide, please. Right, so the old style dictators used violence very publicly. The new style dictators, the informational autocrats, we argue, try to keep repression when they use it private. Next, please. So they want to preserve their image as benevolent democrat. They're acting an effective, competent leader. And that means that they deny responsibility for attacks on regime opponents. They also, rather than imprisoning people as political prisoners for long terms, they prosecute for supposedly non-political crimes to conceal a political motive. And for short spells, they put people repeatedly in jail for short periods rather than sending them to jail for a long time. Next slide, please. I'll just give a couple of examples of this when the slide changes. So, for instance, in Cuba, Fidel Castro jailed some political prisoners for more than 10 years. His brother Raul, when he took over, changed. Mostly he just held dissidents for a few days. You put them in jail before a planned protest, you let them out after. That's enough to disrupt their activities, to intimidate, but without getting Amnesty International involved. Next slide, please. Next slide. On the next slide, if I remember right, examples of or jailed offenses. For instance, one Kurdish leader in Turkey was put in jail. Here we go. Nurettin Demirtas was put in jail for supposedly using a fake health certificate to avoid military service. And in Malaysia, opposition Hi, can everybody hear me? I hope so. Sorry about the interruption there. Okay, so the idea here is to tell the public that you're not using violent repression against your political opponents, but just enforcing the law and non-political law, and also to choose dictators like to choose offenses that will discredit political opponents with their supporters. So you make opposition coward, or you accuse them of sexual crimes which are taboo in the society. Next slide, please. The next slide. It's used. Okay. We also say that the new
Yeah, welcome
sorry,
back.
Yeah,
We've lost you for a while, so could you maybe restart from the ideology slide?
right.
Sorry.
Could you? Yes, there we go. Oh, if we could go back to the ideology. Yeah. So the new kind of dictator, the informational autocrat, doesn't use an official ideology. And we collected data on this, on the presence of official ideology or the use of official ideology by authoritarian governments in all the dictatorships from 1946 to 2015. And we see that there was a sharp drop in the use of official ideologies, which corresponds to the end of the Cold War, clearly. The big fall in Marxist ideology. There's been a slight increase in Islamist states, but not very much. And there's been a reduction in other official ideologies, more idiosyncratic ideologies, like Duvalierism or Mobutism, and so on. Next slide, please. At the same time, informational autocrats pretend that they're democratic leaders. And so we use some data on this from the NELDA data set of Hyde and Marinov. Before we get to that, this is just data on the presence of elected legislatures in authoritarian states. And we see in the mid-20th century, the majority of dictatorships had no elected legislature at all, and this changed over time. Next slide. So that these days, the vast majority has not just an elected legislature, but one in which the opposition parties have at least 5% of the seats. So this shows the increasing tendency to imitate democracy by having formally democratic institutions and just changing the way they operate. Next slide, please. But rather than simply holding free and fair elections, informational autocrats, of course, manipulate elections. Next slide. And they do this in several ways. They're less likely than dictatorships in the 1980s to ban opposition or specific candidates. That's a very public act which reveals the lack of confidence of the incumbent and the lack of democratic practice. But next slide. But instead of that, what they do is more and more they harass opposition candidates. They allow them to run, but make it very difficult for them to campaign. Next, please. They bias the media. This is a measure here of alleged media bias, and we see that increases quite sharply in recent periods. So instead of banning the opposition, they allow it to run, they harass it, they use biased media to make sure that it doesn't get too many votes. Next slide. And to persuade more people that they are actually democratic, they allow international monitors to come and observe the election, but they just try to do the manipulation before the monitors arrive, or else in recent years, they've started to create, groups of informational autocrats have started to create their own, what is sometimes called zombies, whose basic function is to come along to impersonate impartial election monitors and to pronounce on the elections, to declare them legitimate and give a good report. Next slide, please. So instead of simply not holding elections or banning all opposition, they pretend to hold democratic elections and manipulate them in more subtle ways. Now, one other thing we say about informational autocrats is that when they speak to the general public, they tend to use a rhetoric based on demonstrating competence rather than the old kind of rhetoric, which was much more based on spreading fear through violent images. Next slide, please. And to check this, we collected speeches. We analyzed speeches by a selection of major leaders since 1946. some Democrats, some overt dictators, and some informational autocrats. These were all speeches given to the general public. And what we did was very simply to count the frequency of words related to three different topics: violence, economic performance, and public service provision. Now, obviously, we think that we expected the old style overt dictators to use more words related to violence, the new ones to use more language related to economic performance, public service provision. Calibrate, we use the same word dictionaries to analyze texts that we knew would contain violent language, that is, the closing arguments of prosecutors in several war crimes and terrorist trials. And for economics, IMF World Economic Outlook briefings, and public service provision, budget speeches by finance ministers of several democracies. Next slide, please. So here we plot the percentage of words associated with violence and the percentage of words associated with economic performance. Briefings rate very high on economic performance and low on violence. The prosecutors' closing arguments from terrorist and war crimes trials are very high on violence, but low on economic performance. Next, please. Now, if we plot a number of overt dictators, Castro, Kim Jong-un, Hitler, Stalin, and so on, we see they tend to be relatively low on economic performance language, but high on violence language. Next. What about Democrats? Here we have FDR, Obama, Sarkozy, Cameron, Nehru, and Eisenhower, so some from the mid-20th century, some more recent. And we see they're mostly on the higher economic performance and lower violence. So the big question for us was, where would the informational autocrats fit on this graph? Next slide, please. And it turns out, so here are five leaders that we classify as informational autocrats: Lee Kuan Yew, Nazarbayev, Putin, Correa from Ecuador, and Chavez from Venezuela. And they turn out to blend in with the Democrats rather than the overt dictators, as we expected. Next slide, please. And here we, instead of economic performance on the y-axis, we have language related to public service provision. And next, please. And we see again the informational autocrats are much more in line with the Democrats than with the overt dictators. And in fact, some of them seem to talk even more about public service provision than the Democrats. Nazarbayev has so much to say about the schools and hospitals he's been funding and the infrastructure projects that he almost sounds like the budget speech of a finance minister in a democracy. And these speeches, we tried to select speeches to the general public rather than a special audience. They're often, they can be press conferences, just the responses of the leader coded in that case, call-in shows, radio shows, this sort of thing. General speeches rather than anything specifically, say, on economic performance or so on, obviously. Next slide, please. So we see a rhetoric which is quite different from the old, more violent language of the overt dictators. Now, at the start, I said the strategy of informational autocrats is basically to prevent this informed elite from communicating to the general public what's really going on. And some evidence for that comes from some evidence for the fact that the relatively informed elite see through the dictators' deceptions better than the general public comes from the Gallup World Poll. Next slide, please. So we look at approval levels, approval of leaders, and we compare the approval level of those who have completed tertiary education. That's a kind of proxy for membership in the informed elite. So the difference between the approval level of those who've who have completed tertiary education and those who don't. And it turns out that in liberal democracies, those with polity scores of 9 or 10, the people with higher education tend to have higher approval of the incumbent leader. But in illiberal democracies and authoritarian states, the informed elite, as proxied by those with higher education, tend to be somewhat less positive about the incumbent, in line with our argument. Next slide, please. We also find that the people with tertiary education in authoritarian states are more aware of censorship, if censorship exists. So next slide, please. So we look at whether people believe that the media are free or whether they believe the media are restricted by the state. And we compare that to Freedom House's measure of actual media freedom or actual censorship. And we see where, according to Freedom House, the media are completely free, then there is no difference between evaluations of the media by the informed elite with tertiary education and the general public. But in places where the media is unfree, in fact, according to Freedom House, those with tertiary education tend to have a significantly lower estimate of media freedom than those without. So this is in line with our argument that the general public is less aware of censorship when it does actually exist. The informational autocrat is able to conceal the fact that he's using censorship from the general public, at least better than the most educated. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's by way of introduction to our model, introduction to our argument about how dictatorships are changing. I just want to finish by briefly illustrating with a bit about Russia under Putin, which we see as being an informational autocracy, especially in the earlier years. Next slide, please. First of all, if we look at the estimated number of state political killings per year in the Soviet Union and then in Russia, we see, of course, it was highest under Stalin, comes down under Khrushchev. Even under Brezhnev, it's quite low. They're using less killing, more control by other means. It's relatively low under Gorbachev. It jumps up a bit under Yeltsin because of Chechnya. There are some atrocities in Chechnya, more decentralized than centralized, I would say. And then under Putin, we look at 2007 to 15 because those are the years in which, according to polity, which we're using to classify regimes, according to polity, Russia is an authoritarian state. Up till 2006, it's actually rated as a borderline democracy. Okay, so in those years, level of state political killings is relatively low under Putin. Next slide, please. Relatively little violent, relatively low numbers of political killings. Also, relatively few political prisoners, and at least compared to the 20th century dictatorships that existed in the Soviet Union. Next slide, please. We also argue that violence is concealed, right, by informational autocrats. And here we see Alexei Navalny, the leader of much opposition to Putin, instead of being arrested for his political positions and political actions, Navalny has been prosecuted for illegal elk hunting, defrauding a lumber company, defrauding a cosmetics company, and money laundering. All things which ostensibly have nothing to do with politics. Next slide, please. And until very recently, Navalny has been arrested multiple times, but for relatively short periods, for 20 to 30 days, detained and put in jail for organizing unauthorized protests in this manner to disrupt his activities, but not to turn him into a martyr. Now that has perhaps changed now. He's been sentenced to jail for 2 years and 8 months for this old case about defrauding a cosmetics company. So that's a little bit different, and we do have some questions about whether Putin is now heading into a new phase in which he may, in fact, revert to a more traditional kind of dictatorship. Next slide, please. Right. Informational autocrats deny violence. They deny responsibility for violent acts. They imitate democracy. So, as you probably know, Navalny was poisoned recently, according to 2 European labs, by a nerve agent called Novichok, which is owned only by the Russian authorities and is highly restricted. Did the Russian security services poison Navalny, as he claims? Well, according to Putin, no, of course not. He said if they had really wanted to, they would probably have finished the job. Think back to Muammar Gaddafi, who says, we don't just conceal the fact that we kill people, we do it on TV. Quite the opposite here. Putin at one point asked about his democratic credentials, says, of course, I'm an absolute pure Democrat, but you know the problem. After the death of Mahatma Gandhi, there's nobody to talk to. He's the only real Democrat. Of course, this is a kind of cynical accusation of the West for hypocrisy, saying, yes, nobody's perfect, but I'm at least as democratic as you leaders in the West. Next slide, please. Media control, well, instead of complete censorship as in old-style 20th century dictatorships, there's no official censorship, but all the national TV channels are either state-owned or owned by people close to Putin. There's some nominally private media. Most of it is co-opted or pressured to self-censor, but there are some independent media are allowed, so long as they have low circulation. Global sources of information are available on the internet. The new dictators don't block out information completely. They just try to neutralize any effect of critical reports. But over time, there's an increasing attempt to censor internet sites. Next slide, please. Usually quietly, and often for supposedly non-political reasons, like fighting pornography and so on. So here is just the data on requests to Google to remove videos from YouTube, mostly for reasons of national security. This is the number of total requests that Russia has made in recent years, and I think this has gone up even more since then. So they're quietly asking internet companies to remove things they don't like. Next slide, please. Yeah, it's much higher than the US, for instance. Now, I should say the model doesn't work perfectly in all regards. It's an ideal type, and so there are elements in the Putin regime which are anomalous. For instance, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, after protests in 2012, said at one point that the police were too soft. Protesters who hurt riot police should have their livers smeared on the asphalt. Okay, not the sort of rhetoric that we associate with informational autocrats. And as I said, we're not sure what's happening now. It's possible that the model is changing now with Navalny's imprisonment. Next slide, please. But we think it's a useful way to think about this new type of authoritarian regime. So just to sum up very quickly, this model of authoritarian regime, which we call informational autocracy, has become more prevalent in recent decades. As I said, it's not that there were no cases at all that looked like this in previous decades. There were some, and there are still some extremely violent old-style regimes like North Korea, Syria. China is a kind of weird hybrid, but it remains more violent than is consistent with this informational autocracy strategy. So it's not black and white, but there has been a clear shift in the balance to more informational autocracies. And Russia under Putin, especially earlier on, was a good example. Instead of violence, we see manipulation of the media. We see this rhetoric of competence and performance rather than a rhetoric of fear, of violent images. And the reason for this, we think, is that this type of authoritarian strategy is just better adapted to life in a world where economies are much more integrated, where the media operates on a global scale, and where the public is more educated. It's much more difficult to control a more modern, educated, internationally aware public using violent repression and fear, and it has bigger economic costs than a more sophisticated strategy. But we see informational autocracy as a strategy that can work for a while in a modernizing society. At an intermediate level of modernization, it can delay pressure to move to genuine democracy. But ultimately, as the informed elite gets larger, as education spreads, as the economy transforms to a post-industrial structure, as values change, it becomes harder and harder to hold the line. And eventually, we see democracy as becoming the only stable option. Sometimes regimes, in the attempt to survive, may try to move back to a more violent version. But if society continues to modernize, it's very difficult to maintain that over time. And eventually, though there are no predictions in terms of dates, eventually the pressures become so great that some form of imperfect democracy usually emerges. Okay, I'll end there and delighted to take any questions.
First, the question we got, what's the role of private militia type groups in information autocracy? They seem to play a big role in the 20th century, but are they relevant now?
Yeah. In fact, yes, that kind of cuts across. In both the old style, well, in many old style dictatorships, for instance, in Latin America, violent dictators also used paramilitary groups for convenience. And in informational autocracies, when the state does use violence, it's more likely to privatize that violence, to use associates of the government. Not always paramilitary groups, often thugs, martial arts enthusiasts, who the leader can say are independent. So this is also a strategy of increasing deniability when they do use violence. So that also happens in Ukraine, the so-called titushki, thugs that beat up anti-Yanukovych protesters is one example, and we see that in various places. So it's risky for informational autocrats because these thugs can be linked to the regime, and that discredits the incumbent, the dictator. But they do still use that rather than more overt, deliberate use of the state to kill people.
Great, thank you. And are informational autocrats naturally more right, left, industry, labor?
Good question. They're across the spectrum. There are informational autocrats of all kinds. It's really about a method of rule which is compatible with very different political positions. So we see some like Hugo Chavez and Rafael Correa in Latin America who are on the left, who have this kind of image of helping the poor. And then you have some that are clearly on the right, like Viktor Orban You have some that are statists that believe in a strong state, like Putin, or if we look further afield, Lee Kuan Yew. We have others that are more populist, that attack the state and associate it with the elite. So there's a great variety in political flavors, let's say. What they have in common is an approach to exercising power, a set of tactics, and a more general strategy about how they rule.
We have a question from Elizabeth Olson. Do you think these changes, new strategies, would be related to the implications of mass violence and open repression, like international sanctions, international domestic human rights trials? So how does it?
Well, we see one of the things that has led to this change, or is it supporting this change? We see one of the factors is the growth of the international human rights movement. And we see as not just individual countries, but as a sort of cohort of countries has modernized, this has resulted in a growth of both international law, international humanitarian law, and also international human rights organizations and their extraterritorial activities, both in terms of monitoring and on the legal side in terms of putting together extraterritorial cases. So we think that's changed the perspective of dictators to some extent. We see it as part of a broader set of forces, a cocktail of forces associated with modernization and globalization, which together have made the world less hospitable to a kind of Stalin type or Mao type dictatorship, but which have not made it impossible to be a dictator, that have just changed the optimal techniques to sustain power. So yes, the international human rights movement is very much part of that new setting that we see as supporting this trend.
So, and we have a couple of questions from Anton Sobolov. So the first is, we do have this recent protest in Russia, and thousands of people are imprisoned, and it looks like it was done for the show to threaten other people. So do you think that there is a switch to old school of dictatorship?
Yeah, sure. Well, as I said in the talk, we're not sure about that. That could be happening. But there are still some aspects which it hasn't got all the way yet, let's put it that way. Right. What I see in the recent demonstrations is kind of interesting. They're still really trying not to kill people. They're trying to intimidate, and they're trying to lock up a lot more people. I think this is rational, because if you're not going to use extreme violence, then you need to increase people's subjective probability that they will be actually arrested, or that they'll suffer some loss. If the penalty is smaller, you have to make the probability of getting caught larger. So I think they're trying to do that. They're trying to intimidate with very large numbers of police and large numbers of arrest as a substitute for more extreme violence that would shock, but which would risk backlash. And I think they're quite rationally afraid of that. So I would say Putin is an informational autocrat who's been backed into a corner, who doesn't have very good options. And so they're doing things like much more visible, forceful reaction to protests, and actually now putting Navalny in jail for a serious period. They may let him out early. I mean, it would be consistent with our model that they would say he's going to jail for 2 years and 8 months, and then when things die down, they let him out early so as not to have the martyr issue. But they don't have very good options, because as societies get more modernized, and I see Russia as really having a large informed elite now, it gets very hard to make this work. So the pressures are there to really democratize. And when you don't have good options, sometimes you pick one which won't work in the long run, but which looks attractive in the short run.
And we have a couple of related questions from Anton and another anonymous questions. So basically, your theory suggests that there should be a balance between the cost of repression and cost of censorship and propaganda, like being the informational autocrat. But now we know that governments can use new technologies such as, face recognition for the repression. But on the other hand, there's new technology like for spreading information like YouTube. So how can you comment on that?
That's a great question. So there's really kind of two developments in information technology and communications technology. One is related to surveillance, and one is related to communication. You could separate those two. All these new information technologies, I should say, are used by both old style and new style. So we're not saying that that's what distinguishes informational autocrats from old style overt dictators. Among the old style overt dictators, some of them have modernized by using this new technology. So we see China and also Saudi Arabia as being basically old style, overtly violent regimes. So China, it's wavered a bit. At times it's looked like it's heading towards informational autocracy. Under Xi, the level of overt violence in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, and so on is quite high, and they do seem to be using violence to send a message, using violence in Xinjiang to send a message to Hong Kong. Xi is he uses quite violent language at times. So we see China, Saudi Arabia as basically old-style dictators who are using these new technologies to make their repression more effective. That doesn't necessarily mean reducing the level of repression. On the contrary, we don't see a reduction in the level of repression. We just see perhaps better targeting along with a high level of repression. Informational autocrats use the new technology for surveillance, for communications, but they try to persuade people. In our argument, they genuinely try to persuade people that they're good, effective, benevolent, democratic politicians. Now, they can't persuade the informed elite, so there is some censorship, there is even some use of covert violence to censor the informed elite. But they try to persuade the general public, and they try to neutralize messages to the general public using these new communications tools to neutralize messages that would undercut their image of generally competent benevolence.
Oh, and there's a related question from Alison Kuttner. She asks, how do we know that the general public is actually being fooled, not just answering the polls the way as opposed to elites?
Yeah, okay, so it's also a very good question. We've done some research, so we have an article in World Politics which looks at Gallup World Poll data and tries in various ways to try and tease out evidence for or against sensitivity bias there. We're actually quite surprised not to find more evidence of sensitivity bias in relatively violent but not extreme old-style dictatorships. So we don't have polling data from North Korea, for instance, or from Syria, but places like Zimbabwe, various other authoritarian regimes which have used high levels of violence, you might expect there to be high levels of approval for the leader in such countries, or at least to have relatively high percentages of respondents saying don't know or refusing to answer questions about approval of the leader. But we don't see that in the Gallup World Poll. In fact, there's a kind of negative relationship between approval and level of violence if we exclude one or two countries which are in the middle of civil war, ethnic civil wars, where there's a rallying behind the leader. There have been various studies using list experiments in Russia to try and estimate the extent of sensitivity bias in questions about approval of the leader. Background seems to be that there clearly is some sensitivity bias, but estimates would probably range. So we looked at 8 cases, 8 list experiments that other people had done on Putin's approval at about the same time. And the average across those was maybe inflation in his approval of 18%. We think that may be a little bit high, but let's go with that. Even if we accept that 18% more people are saying that they approve of Putin than actually approve of Putin, still, if you subtract that 18%, on average, you end up with 66%. So even taking into account some conformism, some sensitivity bias, it looks like, in Russia at least, a majority, and maybe a significant majority, does, in many periods, approve of Putin. Now, of course, that's because his informational strategy has been effective. He's managed to marginalize discordant voices and make opposition politicians look non-credible or unattractive. So it's not like some kind of genuine, unbiased opinion that might emerge in an open setting, but it's not simply people saying they approve when, in fact, consciously they don't.
And we have a question asking, so what are the criteria that you use to include leaders in informational autocrats? Like, how did you place it?
Okay, so I gave you the broad theory, and so there's a number of elements there. In practice, what we do these days when we want to classify regimes, or to classify leaders specifically, is we use several rules of thumb. And so the main rules of thumb that we've been using lately are, first of all, an informational autocrat has fewer than 10 state political killings per year on average, fewer than 1,000 political prisoners in the peak year. And then we use two measures, two indicators from the VDEM data set, get at other aspects. So there's at least some critical media, and they hold multi-party elections with some opposition party. So authoritarian governments, that is, states with a Polity 2 score of less than 6, that meet those four criteria, we classify using these rules of thumb as informational autocracy. Old-style overt dictatorships have either more than 10 political killings a year or more than 1,000 political prisoners in the peak year, and very limited free media. So using those rules of thumb, we were able to show that actually the proportion of informational autocrats has increased a lot since the 1980s and is now much higher than the proportion of overt dictators, which has fallen.
So as the opposition party is one of your criteria, do those opposition parties actually have, some implications? Can elected legislature play some role in such countries, or is it just, a sham that's nothing?
Well, in contrast to Levitsky and Wei, who classify regimes, intermediate regimes, as competitive authoritarian states, and who do require that there be some genuine competition in the elections, we see informational autocrats as trying to So, no, I think what an informational autocrat aims for is to have opposition parties that are not dangerous, that really have no possibility and maybe even no intent to challenge them in elections or to really threaten them in elections. So, yeah, I think they're mostly the informational autocrat wants them to be for show, but for good show, to look credible. That doesn't mean that things don't sometimes get out of control and go down a path that the informational autocrat was trying to avoid.
So Adam Stolberg has a question. Did you measure the prominence of international and foreign policy assertiveness as an indicator of competence, like Crimea example? If so, how?
Yes. Okay. So we're working on a book manuscript on this, and yes, one chapter is about strategies abroad, foreign policy, and so on. And one thing we looked at was involvement in wars and initiating militarized interstate disputes. You're probably familiar with data on those. And a bit surprisingly, perhaps, it does turn out that informational autocrats, as classified using those rules of thumb I mentioned, are much less likely than overt dictators, and even slightly less likely than democracies, to fight wars or to initiate militarized interstate disputes. Now, I should say Putin is an exception. He has a relatively high rate of, the only major war has been the war in Georgia in this period up until 2015, the only war that's classified as a war in the data sets, because Ukraine, it's less overt. And anyway, but militarized interstate disputes, I think he's had about 45 or something like that in this period. So he's relatively high. He's an exception. But still, even including him, the average for informational autocrats is significantly below that for overt dictators. Now, that shouldn't be surprising because, the dictators who use more violence at home, we would expect to be more willing to use overt violence abroad. Part of the image of informational autocrats is these benevolent, competent democrats. So, it's incompatible with that image to be recklessly initiating military actions. And also, we think it makes sense because military conflicts are dangerous, and informational autocrats are trying to avoid danger by and large.
So we do have kind of related questions. First, do you think there was some event that triggered the shift to informational autocracy style, or was it gradual? And then, do you think that we have witnessed the reversion of the pattern now?
Okay, so we think it was quite gradual. We think there were some pioneers who understood elements of the new logic early, and the key pioneer was Lee Kuan Yew. So in the book manuscript, we actually talk a lot about Lee Kuan Yew and how he realized that you could achieve the same things without violence, and how counterproductive violence could be. We think it took place over quite a long time, so starting really from the 1980s. And I should say there were some cases that kind of fit our rules of thumb before that too. But the big increase came really from the 1980s through to the 2000s. Is it reversing? Well, there are some indicators which suggest, as with measures of democracy, that there's a bit of backsliding. It's hard to evaluate yet because, as with democracy, although there's a lot of attention to backsliding, the extent of it, if you look at data, has not been very great, has only brought us back, maybe a decade or two. But the trend is not so clear. On the one hand, we see contradictory trends, and the net seems to be a bit more violence in various places. So we don't really know about the future. But what we think is driving this in the longer term is modernization and globalization. We don't see evidence that this is significantly reversing. Modernization is quite hard to reverse. We think Putin is trying to freeze modernization in Russia for exactly this reason, to reduce the pressures on him. But it's hard to really go back in time in terms of the post-industrial transition. And globalization, there's a lot of alarm about the world deglobalizing, but if you look at the actual measures, we don't really see that. And we see a lot of movement towards, even though people are quite nervous about it, continuing movement towards greater influence of international human rights organizations and international law, along with other aspects of globalization, even if trade has maybe decreased a bit and some of the other indicators decreased a bit. So hard to read the long-run situation, but we would expect if modernization and globalization continue, which most likely they would, these pressures will intensify in the medium run.
We have a nice question. So 2005 article, Russia is a normal country. Do you still think it's a normal country? Or have you revised these views with informational autocracy position?
Right. Well, the sad thing is that informational autocrats are quite normal these days. I mean, that's our point, that there's a lot of them, that this is a rational strategy for states of a certain type. So it's difficult to answer that question because on the one hand, I want to acknowledge that Russia today looks far more authoritarian and one has to say far less attractive in many ways than Russia in 2004, of course. But at the same time, it would be wrong to say that Russia's current regime is really abnormal. It's really an exemplar of a type which has become increasingly common. I think that's the best answer I can give. It's not an outlier. Russia's not an outlier. The world perhaps has moved in a less positive direction, but Russia has certainly moved with it and remains in the pack rather than being off to one side.
So we have this question. So on one hand side, you're saying that those tensions of human rights movement, international pressures are picking up. And on the other hand side, we see that autocrats are modernizing their strategies and becoming, less punishing, less cruel. So we have this question: do you think that this informational autocracy would actually make democratic upheaval less likely because it's sort of the grievance level is not so bad?
Right. Well, that's clearly the aim. That's the point. Dictators want to protect themselves by reducing the pressure for genuine democratic reform. So yes, but we think it's a temporary equilibrium rather than an equilibrium that will remain an equilibrium long term if modernization and globalization continue, because the kind of pressures, if they increase, make this not work anymore. And so that's what I'd say. And we don't really know what's going to happen in the future, but informational autocracy seems to be something that occurs at a kind of medium range in modernization. Even it's lasted to a very high level of modernization in Singapore. But in Singapore and Russia, it's an open question how much longer that model can continue to work, even in the hands of extremely competent informational autocrats like those in Singapore. I would be less positive about the talent in doing this, talking about Putin in Russia, but one has to admit he's done extremely well with this model over the last 20 years.
And we do have, I believe, the last question. So can you elaborate on China in terms of informational autocracy?
Yeah. Okay, well, obviously in China, there's been a huge decrease in the level of violence since Mao. And in the early 2000s, it looked for a while as though under first Chiang and then Hu, that maybe it was moving towards an informational autocracy strategy. There was still some old-style propaganda in TV and in the media, but there were also some investigative reporting was allowed. There was some independent media or semi-independent media, which was given a freer rein. And there was, it seemed, a somewhat more sophisticated approach. At the same time, large-scale violence continued. So the purge of Falun Gong was really very violent. At the same time, we see especially now under Xi, where the rhetoric has kind of moved back to a more kind of nationalist and violent tone against traitors and terrorists in Xinjiang. We see things like forced confessions and people being forced to make confessions on TV, which is really a sign of wanting to spread fear and demonstrate power more than anything else. We see violent language from Xi, although the Chinese do say sometimes that the Chinese regime is a kind of democracy. At the same time, they make very clear, in the way that 20th century dictators mostly did, that they certainly don't plan to have anything like Western democracy in China. So we see it as kind of a modernized version of the old fear dictatorship, which could end up going in a different direction, perhaps to informational autocracy, which perhaps was heading in that direction before Xi, but which now has moved back to more overtly repressive strategies of dealing with opposition.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan. We're out of time. It was amazing talk, so thank you for doing this.
Thanks for your questions. Yeah, my pleasure.
Yes, bye.